Hi, Ian. How are you doing?
Hi, Kathy. I'm well. How are you?
Welcome to this
Thanks for inviting me.
video. Of course, of course. So I love to start with a quick introduction of yourself. Maybe you can start with a quick introduction and then we can dive straight into it.
Sure. I'm Ian Huyett. I work in New Hampshire doing both litigation and lobbying. And you and I got connected in part because I was the primary lobbyist for a bill that was signed into law in New Hampshire in August that made New Hampshire a top state for access to experimental therapies. And so that got us started on some conversations around could there be a state right to try regime like the New Hampshire has or Montana has, but targeted towards what you do?
Yep. No, absolutely. I think that's super interesting. When you brought that up, to be honest with you, I actually didn't fully understand what that was. But clearly, there's a very important link here to the newer biotechnology areas that we're exploring, including what I'm working on in the preventative pre-birth care area. So glad that you reached out. Thank you for the introduction. I actually didn't realize, in August, that was so soon, so recent. I love to understand kind of how you went from successfully working on that build to your interest in the newer biotechnology areas. How did you stumble upon that?
Well, I've always had some interest in biotech. I don't have any background in biotech. My background is just in civil litigation. And then I got into lobbying, and I've been the primary lobbyist for a dozen or so laws in New Hampshire as a result of my work in constitutional litigation. In the course of being the primary lobbyist for this right to try bill, I just learned a ton of stuff about what regulatory and legal obstacles the biotech industry was facing.
Mhm.
And then at the same time, as a result of that bill, there came to be this just confluence of pro-biotech innovation momentum in New Hampshire as people sort of realized, and I think this realization is taking off more and more all the time, that New Hampshire is ideally positioned to be a pro-innovation jurisdiction. I think it might be better positioned to be a pro-innovation jurisdiction than any other state in the country.
I believe that. I mean, New Hampshire is a pretty politically innovative state, and it's set the precedence for a lot of newer areas, like the right to try framework that you helped build last year. So tell me more about New Hampshire. Maybe for a lot of people out there, they're not too familiar with that state. It's a relatively smaller state on the East Coast, but tell me more about New Hampshire.
Yeah. Well, one thing people should know about New Hampshire is that, and even a lot of people in the Boston area don't realize this. People don't realize that most of the population of New Hampshire is maybe 30 minutes away, maybe 45 minutes away. People in the Boston area, when they go up to New Hampshire, they're usually going up to hike. And so they're going to like the center or the northern part of the state. But all of the major metro areas in New Hampshire, and especially Manchester, which is like the biggest biotech hub in New Hampshire. In fact, if you were to walk around down the downtown Manchester area, Manchester is New Hampshire's biggest city, and you were to just ask people what's in these old mill yard buildings, what are the companies in there, anyone would tell you biotech companies are in there.
Oh, wow.
It's Texas Instruments basically, and it's biotech companies like ARMI, Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute, which is this DoD public-private partnership, and then some companies related to that. Epibone, who supported the right to try law, is this company that will grow grafts, cartilage grafts and bone grafts from your mesenchymal stem cells there in Manchester. So there's this cluster of biotech companies in Manchester. Manchester's maybe, if you were in the Kendall Square area of Boston, or Cambridge, where all of the biotech companies are concentrated, it has the highest concentration of biotech companies in the world in that area. You could hop right onto I-93 and you could be in Manchester in 45 minutes. So
From Boston.
from Boston.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
And it's from Kendall Square specifically,
Wow.
which is where all these biotech companies are now. So with the right policies, New Hampshire could easily like slurp a lot of that business and infrastructure up in New Hampshire like a straw almost.
Mm-hmm.
And New Hampshire is really the only politically innovative state in New England. Theoretically, the fact that New England is this dense patchwork of small states should create a market for policy since people can vote with their feet. Boston's really the only big metro area where you can escape into a totally different policy regime by going 20, 30 minutes away. You can't do that here in New York City. You can't do that in San Francisco, but you can in Boston. So you'd think there'd be all this competition between the New England states, but there really is not because it's like a political monoculture. New England is the only, and not only is it the only Republican-leaning state in New England, but it's currently a Republican trifecta, or technically a superfecta, because we have 4 branches of government. They're all controlled by Republicans. Every other state in New England is the opposite of that. So regardless of what anyone thinks about, partisan political differences, that does illustrate New Hampshire really stands out. And so New Hampshire has always had this awareness that we can use policy innovation specifically to attract business from other states. And that's a big meme in New Hampshire politics. People call that the granite advantage, for example. That's part of the political culture of the state.
That's really helpful to know. Very good too, because I think one of the biggest challenges in newer forms of biotech is regulation. There needs to be responsible regulation, of course, but I also think that a lot of times things move very slowly, especially in my field. Um, Preventative pre-birth care, or specifically using newer forms, more advanced forms of gene editing to tackle genetic diseases, create individualized treatments. Pre-birth is an area that is very interesting, but also has been, it's very promising, but it's been unfortunately very controversial. And as such, I think there needs to be newer alignments between the public, policymakers, healthcare professionals like IVF doctors or other forms of practitioners, scientists who are working on these newer gene editing technologies. But a lot of what's missing here, I think, is the policymaking aspect. From your perspective, what do you think policymakers want to see in an innovative state like New Hampshire to bring this technology to the public, or to consider this technology for more funding, or more research, more advancement to ultimately help patients?
Yeah, well, if your question is what policymakers want to see from the industry, I would say in a state like New Hampshire, any robust industry that we can potentially attract to the state by making policy changes, legislators are interested in. And since we're right by Boston, and Boston is the biggest biotech hub in the world now, I think things are sort of naturally going in that direction in the wake of this right to try law. But if we're talking about what policy changes will attract business, New Hampshire's new right to try framework, which is in RSA 126Z, we are the first state in the country to have a right to try framework where you can pass phase 1. Now, important disclaimer. So New Hampshire's right to try framework is specifically tailored towards people that have life-threatening illnesses. And that's defined as the endpoint of the therapy is survival, or the illness will kill you in the ordinary course of the illness. So New Hampshire kind of it's an apples to oranges thing if you compare us to Montana. Montana's the other best right to try framework in the country. They have not all of the protections we have, but their right to try law right now encompasses people who aren't even terminally or seriously ill. So New Hampshire and Montana have different approaches. But within the framework of treating life-threatening illnesses, if you fall under those criteria and you go through informed consent, you can get our right to try protections even if the therapy you want to get hasn't passed phase 1. It could have been tested on just monkeys, for example. You can waive civil liability down to the stubs. And that's very important in the gene therapy context. And what I mean by down to the stubs is you can waive all civil liability except for bad faith conduct. So you can waive civil liability for negligence. You can waive civil liability for deviating from the standard of care. That sounds scary to people, and it sounded scary to some policymakers when we were passing it. But the reality is that the ordinary civil liability, even in states where there was theoretically like a regulatory allowance, was basically blocking everyone from getting the care that they wanted.
Wow. Well, that would be foundational in some newer biotechnology areas that would essentially serve patients that have no other cures or pathways for treatment. And many of the genetic diseases that I come across, or I talk to patient groups about, they have no cures. In fact, out of 7,000 hereditary genetic diseases, only 5% of them have FDA-approved cures, meaning that there are many, many people that suffer and continue to pass down those known pathogenic mutations that cause these incurable diseases down to their children, and then their children continue to continuously pass that on. So it's a very interesting framework that can definitely philosophically be applied here. So I want to understand, from your perspective, how do you think this type of framework should be applied in these newer biotechnology areas? What kind of patients should have access to these treatments in the very beginning, and then later on as well?
Well, obviously in New Hampshire, we've targeted our regime specifically towards people with life-threatening illnesses. And the reason we do that is because the risk-benefit calculus changes if you have a life-threatening illness. There's a bill coming up right now to create an innovative framework for expand our current innovative framework to encompass people that also just have chronic and debilitating illnesses. The idea being that if, for example, you need a bone graft, you don't qualify under the life-threatening illness definition, but your quality of life is so debilitated, you're willing to do a very different risk-benefit calculus than most people. I think that argument can also easily be made when it comes to preventive pre-birth care. If you have a genetic illness that there's a risk of your children inheriting, then you're going to, in all likelihood, be willing to try something that hasn't gone through the standard regulatory process. Although you were getting at this a moment ago, and I think this is important to talk about, if we're just operating under the standard regulatory regime, the current American legal regime for the approval of biologics, not only is it slowing down development all of the time. Most viewers of this conversation might know about Eroom's law, but when I tell legislators about it, they're usually hearing about it for the first time, which is this principle that the amount of new biologics or drugs approved per dollar invested, adjusted for inflation, halves every decade. So even though the scientific progress is accelerating, more drugs and biologics are approved, the cost per approval is always increasing, and that's clearly a legal and regulatory problem. And I also point out sometimes to legislators that just assume a utopian scenario tomorrow where we have fantastic technology in gene therapy. We have great viral vectors. We have super AI. It's trained on tons of DNA. It can sequence your DNA and identify the problem areas, and it can print a custom donor template for you. If we had that tomorrow and we were poised then to just wage war on genetic disease, nobody really thinks, and no lawyers think, the current federal legal and regulatory apparatus could accommodate that in any kind of sustainable way. So the system we have now just fundamentally isn't working. We obviously need, regardless of this, specialized risk benefit calculus thing, we need a fundamentally new regime.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I talk to patients all the time. One of the recent patients I talked to has a hereditary cancer, pathogenic mutation that's known to cause family members to pass away at a pretty young age. And, they really would like some type of treatment to help them not pass that mutation down to their children. They're undergoing IVF, and it's very sad to see them wanting to have more children, but a large percentage of their embryos are affected by this pathogenic mutation. And it just breaks my heart to look at them in the eye and say, you know what, this treatment is not going to be available for a long time, because even though scientists want to work on it, IVF doctors, a lot of them support this because they also come across patients like this for so many other diseases too. I mean, this it's an important one, but so many diseases have no cures, and there just isn't an option. It simply is a regulatory hurdle that we haven't overcome yet. And so I think the work you're doing is very important. So that's why I really want to highlight this and bring this to the forefront of public discussion, and to gain support from these different groups to essentially help bring these treatments to more mature stages and ultimately be used in the clinic when it's appropriate.
Well, maybe I should mention, I'm especially glad that you have this approach, because when I first started working on this Right to Try bill, I talked to a bunch of people in the industry that I thought might have feedback around, and I was just going to them and asking them, what kind of state legal framework would be most attractive to your business? What would solve the most problems for you? And by and large, I think a lot of people in the industry hadn't really given this any thought. And I think maybe that because there's just so much pessimism and defeatism around the idea that we can secure any legal change, that people hadn't really dug into, if we could have a revolutionary new legal regime, what would that look like?
Since 2012, 2011, research funding in this area has been banned, causing the very few researchers that are actually working on the space to be very discouraged. Their research is not funded. It's very difficult for newer researchers to come into this space because of the lack of funding. And I would say the overall state of the field is, people are pretty defeated. But when I talk to these patients, it gives me hope and a lot of optimism that this is the right thing to do. So that's why I'm working on it. But another thing that's really interesting is the morale, the actually morality and the philosophy around this, which I think actually aligns with what we all want, which if you can actually prevent a disease that is debilitating, causing death, causing suffering, why would you not want to remove the risk of that being passed down to your children and their children? I just don't think that is philosophically challenging to grasp, especially if the technology is getting close to being usable. I mean, there's still a lot of more research that needs to be done, but it's a chicken and egg problem, right? If you cut off the funding, there's not going to be any research. If there's no research, it'll never be safe. And then you can't just keep citing the reason that's not safe for it to not be researched. This is a worthwhile cause for resources, talent to go into to then evaluate the safety of this technology, build upon the safety and efficiency thresholds of current technologies, make it safe for more patients that have different types of diseases. And that's how you create a flywheel effect where it can benefit more people.
Yeah, well, I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm speaking only for myself today, but my regular job is I do litigation and lobbying for an organization in New Hampshire that represents over 100 churches, and the churches were very active in supporting New Hampshire's current right to try framework, mostly for religious and moral reasons. Now there's a lot of business interest. There actually wasn't a lot of business interest when we first started and were in the House. Businesses became interested in this law once they realized it was about to pass. So it was principally driven by religious and moral reasons, and I, as a Christian, would say that we have a moral duty to combat suffering, including by making experimental therapies available to people that are suffering from life-threatening illnesses, and also preventing people, ideally, from inheriting or growing up with life-threatening illnesses in the first place.
One of the major areas of attack from the media is often saying you're playing God, right? It comes down to this religious argument they try to make around we should not change the DNA of embryos because it's you're playing God. This is not according to religious principles. Tell me more about what you think about that, because you just referenced these churches supporting experimental therapies.
Yeah.
What do you think is the religious group, Christian faith, Catholic faith? What's their perspective on this?
I feel like secular people, paradoxically, probably use the phrase playing God more than Christians do. That phrase, playing God, using that as an objection to technology, it really does not have deep roots in the Christian tradition. You can really look throughout 2,000 years of Christian history, and you will find consistently a basically positive attitude towards technology, scientific development, and medicine that's rooted in this Christian idea that we have a dominion mandate to take control over and steward creation to promote human flourishing. And we need to do that in part in order to combat suffering. The cornerstone of Christian ethics is what you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me. The least of these obviously includes people suffering from horrible illnesses or that are going to grow up with horrible illnesses. And of course, in the Bible, Christ's ministry is mostly this ministry of healing miracles. And he invites us in the Gospels to co-participate with him in carrying out this healing ministry. I started my testimony before the New Hampshire House talking about this story in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 9, where Jesus is confronted with this man who was born congenitally blind. And his disciples say, who sinned that this man is blind? Did the man sin or did his parents sin? And I think if you were to take this sort of contemporary pietistic, like playing God kind of framework as your starting point, you might expect that Jesus said something like, oh, he was just born blind so that God could teach him humility through suffering or something like that. God wants illnesses to exist in the world to teach us some moral lesson. But what Christ actually said is, this man was born blind that the works of God might be made manifest in him, and then he healed the man. So his blindness only existed as an obstacle to be conquered. It existed as an enemy to be defeated. Mm-hmm. And then Christ said to his disciples, we must work the works of him who sent me. So, I point out sometimes when you look at classical antiquity, before Christianity, Stoicism, Epicureanism, classical religious beliefs, sickness, suffering, death, these things were viewed as like inherent constraints in the world ordered by the fates. And then it was Christianity that introduced the idea that actually sickness, suffering, etc., these things are products of the fall. They're not part of what it means to be human. They were not part of God's will for us. They have been introduced into the world sort of artificially, and they're enemies to be overcome. They're going to be cast into the lake of fire with the devil. And not only are they enemies, but we are supposed to co-participate with God in conquering them. And there's a long Christian tradition of having, even back to the earliest fathers of the church, of having this kind of theology of technology, where technology is seen as a way to carry out our dominion mandate, to serve and help suffering people. So really through every era of church history, up till maybe about a century ago, whatever technology you're looking at, whether it's canals or electricity or contact lenses or rocketry, you really are not going to find any Christians objecting to that technology by saying this is quote unquote playing God. That's not a natively Christian concept, because our dominion mandate, which involves being imitators of God, is actually part of the Christian tradition.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for providing more context on that. I also think, in some of our previous conversations, what really surprised me was that there's explicit writing from the Vatican Church in the late 1900s. So it's a very visionary statement. It's just a lot of great foreshadowing here. But the idea that fundamentally the church is not against this idea of reducing suffering by preventing diseases prior to birth. Do you want to tell me more about that? I think this is something that more people should know about.
Yeah, well, you're referring to Donum Vitae, which is a Roman Catholic doctrinal statement. So, of course, in the U.S., most Christians are either Protestants or Roman Catholics. Also, there's a third major branch of the church, Eastern Orthodoxy. And Protestants, of course, have a wide variety of perspectives on things like IVF. The Roman Catholic Church of the universal sort of Christian church is the only major kind of doctrinal institution that takes a hardline stance against IVF per se. This 1987 document you're referring to comes from the Catholic Church's highest doctrinal office, and it's mostly dedicated to explaining why the Catholic Church is going to view IVF as per se prohibited. Protestants don't have an equivalent highest doctrinal authority. Protestants have a wide variety of perspectives on IVF. Eastern Orthodoxy actually is similar to Roman Catholicism in that they have these high-level magisterial statements, and those are more positive towards IVF. They typically say things like, IVF is good if you're not discarding embryos and it's done within the context of marriage. But so within Donum Vitae, which is mostly known today, 1987, for prohibiting IVF, there's a paragraph where they want to address kind of every possible iteration and permutation of what are the implications of this prohibition. And so even back in 1987, the Catholic Church was exploring this idea of preventative pre-birth care. What if we could do gene correction on an embryo? And there's an entire paragraph saying in Donum Vitae, it's titled, "Are therapies performed on the human embryo licit?" And what that paragraph says, and this was probably drafted by Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict, probably drafted that paragraph. It says that therapies done on an embryo that respect the life and integrity of the embryo and are done for the purpose of preserving or promoting the health and individual existence of the embryo must be supported as licit. And then there's a quote from Pope John Paul II, who was Pope at the time, saying expressly, if you could fix a malady in an embryo, and he gives the example of like a chromosomal aberration. So he's thinking of a kind of genetic ailment. He says that would in principle be desirable, and that would be consistent with the logic of the Christian tradition. So even in 1987, that's the most binding doctrinal statement from the Roman Catholic Church on preventive pre-birth care. And they're clearly saying that it is licit. Now, it's a bit of a paradox there, because as I said, the only major Christian denomination that has this per se prohibition on IVF is the Roman Catholic Church, but they're also probably the only major Christian denomination that has this binding doctrinal paragraph that's very authoritative, saying preventive gene correction on an embryo would be desirable. And I think what that means in practice is, although Roman Catholics will continue to oppose IVF per se, they cannot have any additional theological objection to corrective gene therapy on an embryo done for those purposes, done for the kinds of purposes that you would like to engage in and that everyone in this industry wants to focus on, of preventing heritable disease.
That's new for a lot of people to hear for the first time. And I want to actually explicitly have that paragraph in the video to show everybody that this is indeed a real document that Ian's referring to, that is from the highest level of the Catholic church and religion. I think it's, when I found out about this, I was blown away because that's just not the narrative you see in the media. And yet it makes logical sense. It's the right thing to do. And I'm so glad that there was so much vision when that document was written in 1987, that back then there were no gene therapies. There was no there was no gene therapies or germline type technologies. So the fact that Pope John Paul II explicitly endorsed this technology to help remove the risk of disease, maladies in embryos, giving the example of a chromosomal abnormality is just, it's amazing. I think it's
Right.
what the industry needs to hear. I think any scientist, any anyone supporting patients, the public, regulators, they should all know this fact, that this document exists, that even religious groups who, for some reason, is labeled in the media to respond to this technology in a certain way, they actually support this. So I think that's really, really incredible. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, Arkansas is one of, probably 6 states in the country that mandates insurers cover IVF, and that wasn't passed by secular progressives in Arkansas, to give a Protestant example, since Arkansas is more Protestant.
Mhm.
But, when it comes to this statement in Donum Vitae, it's directly on point, and it's consistent with this long Christian tradition of being very forward thinking about science and technology that I described, that goes back through antiquity and through the Middle Ages. You can consistently see Christian theologians talking about technology in terms of there are various evils in the world that it is our duty to overcome. We're not somehow pious because we accept and are resigned to those evils. That shouldn't be our attitude towards evil as believers. These things are artificial constraints imposed on the world that we're supposed to contend with and conquer and overcome. And sometimes when, especially people in the biotech industry, when they say to me that they assumed Christianity was more inherently anti-technological or anti-innovative, I guess maybe the 2 big examples I get are like Galileo in the Renaissance, and then Donum Vitae, actually, this statement on IVF. But neither of those things, in neither of those cases, were Christians motivated by this idea that if you're using technology to promote human flourishing and you're manipulating creation to that end, that's somehow quote unquote playing God. Donum Vitae, this Catholic prohibition on IVF, is not motivated by that sort of popular level playing God objection. And you can see that clearly in this paragraph. If the objection was playing God, if the objection was we don't want to meddle too much with the fundamental stuff of creation, even if it's for a good purpose, that paragraph would not be in there.
Yeah, I think every revolutionary biotechnology, whether it's it's a change in the way that medicine is administered, it's the discovery of a new technology. I'm thinking of the example IVF. If people continued with this reaction that it was playing God, millions of children would not be born, or millions of people who are now adults now, they would not be born today. So, I understand that gene editing is such a powerful technology that it unfortunately triggers a lot of fear in people, but it's really great to know that from a morality standpoint and from a patient medical need standpoint, it's something that should be explored further. It's something that should be encouraged for researchers, for patients, for IVF doctors to engage in further, and hopefully bring a therapy to the clinic that patients can benefit from, to ultimately not pass down those diseases to their children.
Yeah. Well, let me quickly add while we're on the topic of IVF, because I think this is an important clarification. While that Catholic doctrinal statement, Donum Vitae, has a per se prohibition on IVF, and it's rooted in the theology of Thomas Aquinas, which has a very elevated status within the Catholic Church. And this particular Thomistic or associated with Thomas Aquinas concern about we don't want assistance in the act of reproduction because marriage needs to have this unitive and procreative aspect. That's more or less the justification in this document. That justification is not the justification you will hear from most Christians in the pews in most denominations to IVF. Many people, including many Protestants, if you say IVF, they will instinctively have a negative reaction. But if you ask them what's objectionable about IVF, pretty much all of them, including most just regular Roman Catholics, will tell you the problem is that it kills embryos. It discards unwanted embryos. I think most Orthodox conservative Christians, their theological objection to IVF is not quite what we find in Donum Vitae. It's more about the discarding of the unwanted embryos.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I think right now in 2026, the status quo in IVF procedures worldwide is that when you go through IVF and you have a number of embryos that you create, there is a process called PGT, which enables companies to sequence and then screen and then tell you which embryos will have disease, which ones you should use instead of the ones that have disease and disease mutations, for example, and to use the embryos that look healthy to them through processes like PGTM for monogenic diseases, PGTP for polygenic risk scores, and PGTA for chromosomal abnormality. For all of these tests, through all of these tests, they tell you which embryos to actually implant and turn ultimately into a live birth in the child, and which embryos to then freeze, never use, or to discard. On the topic of discarding embryos, I think it's really important to point out that this technology represents the potential for families to discard less embryos or not to discard any embryos because it gives parents the choice to correct the bad mutation in those embryos and give them more chance at having healthy children because now you can implant more healthy embryos to then turn into live births and children. I think that's a really good change from the current status quo because when you're going through IVF as a couple, you're already typically, on average, a little bit older. Or if you find out you have a hereditary genetic disease, you go through this earlier to have more chances of having healthy children. But you ultimately don't have that many embryos to choose from. A lucky couple may have, 5 embryos to choose from, and not all of them will implant. And then the company will tell you which embryos to discard versus which ones to keep. I think the option to then I think sequencing is the right thing to do. You want to find out if they have certain disease or not, but then to throw away those that have a disease automatically, I think, if we can save those embryos, I think that's the right thing from, any angle, any perspective. I think, everyone should agree that giving parents more chances of having healthy children, a higher success rate with their IVF cycle is a good thing.
Right. The goal of combating illness and promoting human flourishing, I think that's a long-standing, well-established goal in the Christian tradition. It's good in and of itself. But also, if people have concerns about personhood with respect to embryos, or they're even just inclined towards the idea embryos might be persons, and so they want to protect them, then obviously any technology where we massively reduce the number of discarded embryos is much better than the status quo.
I think those are all really fair points. And I wish the public knew more about that because I think it's so easy to have a clickbait headline these days and say it's, either quote unquote playing God or, it's somehow bad. I just don't think that's the truth. And I'm hoping that more and more people can see this message and to see the real reason why we're all working towards this from so many different angles, from researchers to patient advocacy groups I've spoken to politicians and regulators. I think there's so much good reason and righteousness for this technology to be explored further to ultimately be brought to the clinic.
Yeah, amen. Well said. It is righteous.
So obviously this is a very important technology to get right from so many perspectives. And from a policy standpoint and from a regulator standpoint, what do you see is the right change that needs to happen? And where do you see us going from here? This is early 2026. Where do you want to see us in 2027, 2028? I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Well, it might be helpful to talk about what are the current legal and regulatory obstructions to gene therapy specifically. Obviously, there are a handful of different things. You mentioned some appropriations riders that are bans on public funding of research. But even aside from that, I think the really pivotal things are basically two things. One, the FDA, as a matter of their internal policies and regulations, chooses to assert jurisdiction over gene therapy under the Public Health Services Act, which says that the FDA can regulate things like viruses, blood components, and analogous products. If they didn't invoke that, they could invoke another FDR-era act, probably called the FDCA, which gives them carte blanche regulatory authority over quote-unquote drugs, which is defined in this completely open-ended way. And right now, the FDA says we construe any individual gene therapy, not just the viral vector, but the entire combination that is the gene therapy, we construe that as a product under our jurisdiction requiring approval. The FDA does not need to do that. obviously gene therapy isn't specified in these FDR era statutes. And in other areas, the FDA has chosen not to construe certain things as biologics or drugs that they regulate. IVF is not considered to be a biologic or a drug. That's considered to be part of the practice of medicine, which means IVF is left to several protections. It's not as if we live in the Wild West when it comes to IVF. IVF is subject to state licensing boards, state departments of health. It's subject to medical malpractice and other forms of tort liability. And if a state enacts a statutory framework governing IVF or governing experimental therapies, when you regulate something as the practice of medicine instead of as a drug or biologic, it still has all those protections in place. And I'm really struck by the fact that when we ask ourselves what it would look like if the FDA just said, okay, we know more about gene therapy now. We are not going to treat it as a drug or biologic. It's a procedure. It's gene surgery. And now it's going to be regulated as part of the practice of medicine. So it's subject to that whole panoply of safeguards I just mentioned. In all of the legal literature on this, no legal scholar or person thinking and writing about this really seems to be able to point to, if that happened, what substantive safeguard would be removed? In what way would we be more endangered as the public if it was treated as the practice of medicine? Nobody can really explain that. And as I mentioned earlier, even if we were totally poised technologically to just start an all-out war on genetic disease, nobody thinks the current legal regime is a sustainable way to do that. So if I was like dictator of biotech policy, I mean, the first thing I would do would be to say, the FDA is now going to treat gene therapy as the practice of medicine. Or at least I would say we're going to treat it that way in states that have robust regimes kind of trying to regulate this technology in a certain way. And then I would also focus on shoring up state legal regimes like New Hampshire or like Montana, because that's how our federal system was meant to work. It was meant to work as a marketplace for policy where states can be laboratories of innovation and people can vote with their feet, and we can look at all of these different options and see what works. Right to try laws have worked in a very limited way. Most state right to try laws have failed to really encompass and protect very many therapies, but the handful of therapies they have protected and have allowed have worked from a legal and political standpoint. So I think have changed federal policy and regulation, expand state legal regimes when it comes to experimental therapies. And then, if I had even more power, then I would obviously change the congressional funding mechanisms and try to find some avenues to put more public funding into biotech innovation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of the current technologies related to IVF as well, like embryo sequencing and screening, those are not regulated by the FDA, and it's causing millions of embryos to be discarded. So I think from a consistency standpoint, this personalized gene therapy or personalized method of correcting a mutation to reduce that risk, or to reduce the number of embryos to be discarded, should also be treated similarly. And I hope that on a state level, to set the precedence for this, it will have some impact on the federal, or at least other states' perspective on how this technology should be regulated on a state level.
Yeah, that's right. People sometimes forget about this gray area between law and politics. And a lot of biotech policy, I think, is decided in that gray area. There's really no principled reason in any, for example, federal statutory framework, why IVF should be regulated as the practice of medicine and gene therapy should be regulated as a biologic or a drug. Mm-hmm. When the FDA tries to regulate, for example, a company that wants to give you an injection of your own cultured mesenchymal stem cells, and they want to treat that as a drug, courts will let them treat it as a drug because they have this totally open-ended authority. And yet they're just choosing not to assert jurisdiction in that way over IVF. So without congressional change, we could have revolutionary policy change in the US tomorrow if gene therapy was classified differently in the way that IVF is, as a matter of just federal agency policy and regulation without congressional change.
Yeah. Wow. So how do you foresee, what do you think are the next steps here for the state of New Hampshire to adopt new policies in order for this technology um, to be researched and then later on practiced. What do you think? Yeah, what do you think are the next steps here? And tell me about the dynamics with New Hampshire and the right to try framework that the regulators in New Hampshire are, thinking about in application of this technology.
Right. So our new right to try law went into effect January 1st. It's brand new. There's already multiple follow-on bills to expand it. And part of the reason for that is now we have a lot more direct involvement from the industry. One of the big political hurdles I encountered was lack of direct industry involvement. And now we have that. So I think things are going to be easier when it comes to these follow-on bills. And maybe I should say something about what those are. So I've heard legislators in New Hampshire expressed interest in doing something like what you're doing and what we're talking about here in New Hampshire. But the already introduced follow-on bills are an expansion of our current right to try framework to encompass chronic and debilitating illnesses. So Representative Brian Cole, who's a candidate for Congress, has a bill introduced that would do that. And also Representative Erica Lahan has a bill that would expand our current framework to encompass chronic and debilitating illnesses, and it would introduce Florida's regenerative stem cell sectoral protections. Florida has the specific sectoral right to try regime around regenerative stem cell therapies. And then Representative Kesselring, who is a major leader in favor of our current right to try law, alongside Representative Lisa Mazer, who is the prime sponsor, he has a bill that would be a copy and paste of Montana's framework. So what you can see there, and there's a variety of companies involved in promoting all those bills. So there's a lot of momentum now around this idea that we should make New Hampshire a pro-biotech hub. I think people now are coming around to just realizing the logic of this. If you just looked at a map of the US and asked yourself, where would we build a pro-biotech hub from a policy standpoint to promote these kinds of innovations? I can't see what the argument would be for it being a state other than New Hampshire, frankly, especially in light of Boston being the biggest biotech hub. As more and more people realize that, I think you're going to see more and more momentum in this area and things will get better and better.
Yeah, it's great to hear that more and more regulators are on board with this, or are at least, giving positive signals that this is something that they would like to see in New Hampshire. I think on the business side, with industry support, I think you're going to only see more and more of it. I mean, I think when, I launched a preventative pre-birth care initiative last year, I saw a tremendous amount of support from the public, from patients, from IVF doctors in a way I never expected. I think the tide is finally shifting, and I'm glad that there are states like New Hampshire who are considering this more seriously and actually making the necessary policy changes to allow this to take place in those states. Oh, from a business angle as well, I think there's so much that New Hampshire can benefit from being a politically innovative state at this particular time with this particular type of technology, because it's something that it requires a place that's politically innovative and takes into consideration, all of the points that we discussed. It's going to be one of the only places in the world where this is going to be not just allowed, but it's going to attract the right type of talent from very talented American researchers, doctors, scientists to kind of come into New Hampshire and perform these treatments. It's going to be a global hub, I think, for this newer biotechnology era of treatments being available to patients. I'm already seeing that so from my angle as an entrepreneur who is operating a business in this space, I have patients reaching out to me all the time, wanting this type of treatment. And although the current legislation doesn't support it, and there's still some research that needs to be done, I think a lot of those people would go to New Hampshire when the technology is ready, when the regulation is ready as well. So it's going to create a lot of business value for the state of New Hampshire if this bill were to be passed.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know as much as you do about the market size for preventive gene correction, but I do know when it comes to just treating life-threatening illnesses, which New Hampshire's current regime has already focused on that, the highest spending 5% of the country probably spends around $125 billion on terminal illness care or care in the last year of their lives. So there's tremendous potential for a multi-billion-dollar market equivalent to like the current GDP of New Hampshire around a medical tourism hub, even if we're just talking about treating people who have life-threatening illnesses. And I think that's just going to snowball as people identify more and more areas of policy innovation where states can lead the way in creating innovative frameworks to complement and provide alternatives to the existing continuously failing federal regulatory framework.
Well, healthcare costs are the largest cost in this country, and it's the same for many, many other countries. And when you think about the current healthcare system, a lot of the costs come from the diagnosis and treatment of these diseases, with very expensive cures. Other types of gene therapies, like sickle cell disease Casgevy, it costs $2 million per patient per dose USD. That's just not affordable. And so when we think about the value of this, we think about turning the healthcare system from one that is treating these diseases with very expensive cures to one that is preventing these diseases. And from a national level, regardless of which country you're from, there are hereditary diseases in every country. And given that it's the biggest cost of healthcare, to prevent it represents so much value for any country. So I think hopefully with New Hampshire leading the way from a regulatory standpoint, the federal entities as well as other countries can follow suit in understanding the value of this for not just healthcare costs, but ultimately patients, reducing suffering for them.
That's right. And that's an important point when we talk about public investment in biotech innovation, because we've been talking about ways that you could unleash innovation and have a revolution in biotech just by eliminating or changing the existing prohibitions and the existing regulatory regime. But I think what you're bringing up is sort of a strong point in favor of public funding of biotech innovation as a fiscally conservative decision, because the more preventative treatment that you have that's effective, ultimately the less you spend on these like tremendous end-of-life care costs, or just trying to manage the illnesses of people who have genetic conditions that could have been prevented if they'd been treated prenatally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's the right thing to do. It's a responsible thing to do, and ultimately it's the human thing to do, to reduce suffering when we know we have the chance to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming to New York to meet with me.
Thank you very much.
It was
You do it anytime.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure to listen to all of your perspectives. It's very refreshing. I talked to a lot of researchers, patients, IVF doctors, but it's really great to hear it from you and also from the religious perspective. So thank you so much for being here.
Anytime. Looking forward to you coming to New Hampshire before too long.
Yeah, I'll be there soon.
All right.